And that'll give Roger time for his talk and us time for discussion, which I think we'll all agree would be the most exciting parts of this thing. But introducing Roger could take a good portion of the time we have. And I'm going to skip a lot of that because I think his reputation precedes him. And also, this stuff is online. And so I'm just going to try and highlight some things for people because I suspect each of you are familiar with Roger in some way, but probably don't know a lot about what he does because he does so much. So he is his current position is Vice Chair of CASEL's Board of Education. And CASEL, for those who don't know, is not the CASEL we know at UVA. It's the CASEL Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. And he's the Vice Chair of their Board of Directors and their Chief Knowledge Officer. He's also the Novo Foundation Endowed Chair in Social and Emotional Learning and the Liberal Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of Psychology and Education at the University of Illinois, where he directs the Social and Emotional Learning Research Group. He's also a University of Illinois Distinguished Professor. So as many know, for the past 3 years, Roger has been involved in training many scholars and practitioners, working in innovative ways to design, implement, and evaluate interventions, and working really at the intersection of thinking about child development in a very broad way and health in a very broad way, and what does that mean about policy in particular? And how do we take what we know or we learn or we think is important and get that translated into action that makes a difference, a real difference in kids' lives. He's made many contributions. He's authored over 200 publications. 2 books that recently come out that have been particularly influential and important are the 2013 CASEL Guide for Effective Social and Emotional Learning Programs for Preschool and Elementary School Education edition, and then also the Handbook of Social and Emotional Learning Research and Practice. He's co-chaired an American Psychological Association task force on prevention, promoting strength, resilience, and health in young people. And this really was the bridge from prevention to promotion in a way that hadn't been there before, and changed the way many of us thought about what the role of prevention was in child development and promotion. He's received numerous awards, including the National Mental Health Association's Leela Rowland Prevention Award and the 2000 American Psychological Association's Distinguished Contributions Award for Application of Psychology to Education, and the 2008 Daring Dozen Award from the George Lucas Educational Foundation for being one of 12 people who are reshaping the future of education. And in 2013, he was elected to the National Academy of Educators. He's been at UIC since 1992, which is where I really became acquainted to him, had the opportunity to be involved with him both in terms of a prevention science postdoc, but also his presence, his engagement, and his creation of enthusiasm for prevention at UIC. And along with his wife Stephanie, he has really 2 wonderful children. That is true, Elizabeth and Ted. And Roger and I at this point spend more time talking about our children than we do most things, but he's been one of my favorite people to help me understand how little I knew about how science interrelates to policy. He's really been the person who, in these conversations that I've been able to be a part of, has helped us all sort of stop and think about how we really are just a voice within a group that's in a conversation, and we need to expand out. We need to think more practically, and then we need to recognize what we have to offer and what we don't. And he's done that for the field, really, and that's how I think social emotional learning is now the dominant approach to understanding positive youth development and for understanding how to help promote education. So it's really a great honor to introduce him and a great opportunity to have him here. And with that, I'll let him take the podium.
Good morning.
Morning.
Pat's a very good friend, and so thank you, Pat, for your kind introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to University of Virginia. Is there feedback, or am I just hearing the feedback? Just me. This is my first trip here, and it's really fun to be here. It's very exciting. And I was thinking, I was just talking with Catherine Ross before the meeting, and we talked about career trajectories, and for some reason it reminded me of Katharine Graham, who was the editor of the Washington Post, who at one point said to love what you do and feel that it matters, that can make life fun. And I think that probably has been one of my favorite quotations over the years, because the work that I do, I love it. I'm intellectually interested in my areas of research, and also connections to practice and policy. And it's probably the connections to practice and policy, and feeling that I'm making a difference, hopefully, in children's lives that really drives and motivates me and makes things fun. And a great part of that is being a collaborator. So you hear about academics and the importance of being a rugged individualist. I've never been a rugged individual. Well, maybe I am in certain ways, actually, and entrepreneurial in other ways, but at the same time, it's through being interested in so many things and realizing you can't do it all yourself, that you foster collaborative relationships. And I really think that that is the way that science can move forward in multidisciplinary kinds of ways to make a difference, especially for those of us who care so much about children and their positive development. So I was thinking about coming to UVA, and of course I made a list. Of all the people I know here, and I was kind of shocked that I have never come. And actually, everybody on this list that you see, I've met personally and talked with or communicated with in one way, except for one person on the list. And I wanted people, maybe someone younger in the audience, to say who that might be. There's one person who maybe you haven't seen around campus that much.
He's still here.
Ralph Sampson, yes. Now, like Ralph Sampson was 7'4" and an amazing basketball player, and I always wanted to meet him. But the other people on the list, I actually have such regard for and appreciation for the work, and that's why I thought that I'd like to give in this talk a kind of an overview of a lot of the things. This is like the survey course of work that I have been involved with, which I thought I would give an overview with, and if I really had it my way, it would be staying for a couple of days, couple of weeks to follow up with some of the conversations, because I think you'll find a lot of the things that I have done, first of all, I've been influenced by people in the room. Second of all, in some instances, should be more influenced by people in the room. And again, that's kind of the collaborative mentality, so I'll spend some time talking, sharing these ideas. Pat said, maybe almost an hour, and then have conversation, and hopefully it'd be the beginning of a conversation that can be ongoing. To go back a little bit, and I didn't see if Joe was here. Joe Allen, just so you know, in the first class I ever taught in graduate school, Joe was a student in that class in developmental psychopathology in 1982 at Yale. This was a class that also had Peter Salovey, who's now the president of Yale, and a number of other very remarkable people. And it's very interesting because I came into that class, my first graduate class, and I had 25 pages of notes, and they let me get through the third page. And that was the end of lectures in graduate school and the beginning of seminars, actually. And maybe there's a transactional model. They taught me, I think, how to be a professor with engaged, excited students who had a lot of ideas that they wanted to dialogue about. And so Joe and I wrote a chapter that I remembered, and promoting children's social skills and adaptive interpersonal behavior. This is in 1986, so clearly social and emotional learning, which I'll talk about. I've had an interest in this area for a long, long period of time, and it wasn't always called SEL, and that's maybe one of the complexities. And I'll use a couple of different names maybe for it, even during this conversation, and tell you why some of these things are important to cover. But there's been a long history. I didn't go back and read the chapter. I think that I'd probably be embarrassed by maybe some of it, but maybe also, oh, I really had that. One thing is I hate to write. You should know that. I write a lot, but I don't like to write. But I love to read what I wrote. And so. Yeah. So let me give you an advance organizer of what I'll say now, but what I'll come back to. Starting in about 2010, this organization, CASEL, that I work with, and I'll say a little bit about CASEL, became very interested in saying, how could we transform education in the United States? How could we really have a balanced education where we would care about kids' social, emotional, and academic development as a core part of education? And what role should we play? How could we help? And then in 2015, we revisited our strategic plan and said, okay, so if we're going to have evidence-based systemic social and emotional learning in 50% of the nation's schools by 2025, preschool through high school, what are the things that we have to do strategically to make that happen? And we identified 6 areas, and at CASEL now, Pat in his introduction said I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer. Being Chief Knowledge Officer is kind of fun because basically it means I can do anything that I find important and interesting. And a lot of the work that I do has to do with national collaborations. And so this first topic, co-convene kindred groups to advance research, practice, and policy. Originally, CASEL didn't have a staff at all, actually. We were just a bunch of national collaborators taking on projects that we thought were interesting. But now there is a national commission on social, emotional, and academic development. And the Aspen Institute is convening that institute. Tim Shriver, who's the chair of CASEL's board, and Linda Darling-Hammond, who's on our board, are 2 of the co-chairs, along with Governor Engler, who's now with the Business Roundtable. But this is a group, and there are 25 commissioners. I'm a commissioner, and there's a distinguished science panel, a distinguished practice panel, a distinguished youth, a lot of distinguished, I guess. Youth panel, parent panel, and the idea is to bring together people from disparate perspectives who use different language, but say, can we find the commonalities, and how do we all relate together in an umbrella of interest so that schools promote students' social, emotional, and academic development. So this is a big undertaking, and there's going to be a report to the nation in 2 years that will kind of highlight, here's where we stand with research, with practice, with policy, and here's a roadmap of where we should go for the next 10 years. It's a much longer story, and I could say a little bit about it. I think that the field's Achilles heel is that we have to do a better job with assessment. So again, CASEL, when we're interested in a topic, we invite people, and there are 2 aspects of the invitations. One is we try to bring researchers together who have different perspectives, maybe, about how to measure social and emotional competence in this case. And we also have practitioners at the table from the start in anything we do. So we have people at this point from research and evaluation departments from several school districts in the country, 20 of us who are meeting, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but one of the big priorities that we have to deal with is this issue of assessment and how to do it well. We've gone through the years, we've had an interest in programs, we've had interest in school-wide programming, we've had interest in how to work with districts. A lot of our current work is done at the district level, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we now are, as of today, working with about 20 districts serving 2.5 million kids, and we're trying to create guides, central office guides and school guides for how to do systemic social and emotional work. And we want to do basic work and development work with these large districts, kind of trailblazing in ways that haven't been done so much before. So a lot of it's called collaborating districts, the work that we do, because we really have to collaborate with districts to find out the best of what they're doing, the best of what we're thinking, how do we combine these things, and how do we create lessons and learn from this process. So it's a different kind of action research that we're involved with, and we want to take the learnings from these districts, but also share them more broadly with other districts. You know, there are 15,000 districts, and there are a lot of large districts and small districts. So how can we take knowledge and expand that work? And we're funded by Wallace Foundation, actually, to create guides for how to do this work that will be downloaded for free, either from the Castle webpage or from the Wallace webpage in a couple of months. And I think that this is important. Castle's always been very mission-driven. We don't want really costs to get in the way of doing quality programming for kids. At the same time, we recognize that when you work with districts, it's important to have a financial investment probably made in some aspects of this work. And I could talk a lot. We've done some financial analyses of the work with districts, and very often, you know, they devote a lot of money to this work, and we help them to integrate the efforts kind of on the financial side of things. Then we have something called the Collaborating States Initiative that we started working with, and we thought we were going to work with 5 states, and right now we're working with 17 states on policies and standards and implementation guidelines for social and emotional learning. And then finally, you know, I guess this slide is dated, but we're still going to continue to work for federal supports for SEL research and practice, and work with the Department of Education on that a bit, and work with people in Congress to advance some of this work as well. So this kind of overview that I've just given is really part of a strategic plan that we're in the midst of. And part of this is asking the question, how do you go from the State House to the schoolhouse to the classroom and have impact with this work? So I mentioned that I was interested, even when Joe and I worked together at Yale in the 1980s. I actually have been interested in only one question as a professional for 40 years. And I discovered my question in 1976 like a lightning bolt, in a way. Emory Cowan was my dissertation advisor at Rochester, and Emory was invited to give a speech at the American Psychological Association, and it was called Baby Steps to Primary Prevention. And he said there are too many kids who have problems. There's never going to be enough helping resources, professional resources for those kids. So what we have to figure out is, how do we get schools and families and communities to work together to promote positive outcomes in kids? And I heard that. I remember, because I was at this speech, and I was the one who handed out papers for Emory at the meeting, you know, and was sitting in the front row, and I said, that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, you know, and at least for 40 years. That's all I've done as a professional. So that's some of the history, and I'm going to summarize now in one slide everything I've learned in 40 years. So I thought that I would share that. In terms of actionable, research-based family and school and community approaches. On the one hand, clearly we have to do things to support and strengthen family functioning. And everybody needs, I think, a sustained relationship with some caring adults that are responsible, caring, and supportive. Every child needs that. You have to provide high-quality education, and you need to connect students to schools. They have to feel it's relevant and important, that they are going to learn things that mean things to them, and they're going to invest and feel motivated and engaged in some way. You have to have communities that are safe and supportive, and create high-quality out-of-school time programming for kids. So there's a family, adult, kid relationship component, an education component, an out-of-school time community component. And then there is the importance, I think, of providing children and youth with opportunities to build their social and emotional competence, to develop key competencies that help them to navigate the world effectively. And that's really the key focus of a lot of the work that CASEL has been involved with. And I think that some of the key questions we started out with were the question, are people with better social and emotional skills more likely to succeed in school and life? Well, there's so much research, there's so many correlational studies, there's so many longitudinal studies, there's so much data that says, yes, if you're socially and emotionally competent, you're going to thrive more in life. Can they be taught? Well, now I think there's 30 years of research that says yes. It can be taught and with benefit, and I'll share a little bit from some of the meta-analyses we've done in that area. Will children be better prepared for college, career, and life if we teach social and emotional and academic skills? Again, I'll say I could talk about research in this area, but I'll just say anecdotally with an N of 1, me as a professor, who's been a professor for 35 years, the students who mess up or screwing up are not the ones who have kind of academic struggles. They're the ones who have social and emotional struggles. They get behind and they disappear, or they need help and they don't seek help for this and the support that they need. They get into fights with their roommates, or they make bad choices and they stop coming to classes and things like that. I think that many of the students, and there's an academic preparation, obviously, that's critical to be successful in school, but there are also resources that people can access, and increasingly now, and it's been interesting because I have been pre-K to 12, but the number of colleges across the country now that are saying, hey, we need to do things to address social and emotional competencies of our students is really growing too. And so then the key challenge is, how do we ensure that educators or service providers or families can develop these social and emotional skills effectively in young people? And that's a lot of the focus of the work that we do. So CASEL, the other CASEL, when was CASEL, your CASEL, when did that come into existence? Was it after 1994? Or? Okay, so we're the first CASEL. We're CASEL 1. I don't know. But CASEL was founded in 1994. And there were about 30 of us who came together at the Fetzer Institute in all kinds of fragmentation areas, like from drug prevention, violence prevention, service learning, character education, and I could go on and on with the groups that were there. And we basically all felt marginalized in some way, and we said, how do we bring together a field? This was when Dan Goleman was writing the book, Emotional Intelligence. Said it was a different way of being smart. It could be taught. Schools should do it in evidence-based ways. There should be an organization to do this. And we did not like the term emotional intelligence because some people think that intelligence is fixed, even though we know now that that is not the case. We thought that relationships were important. We thought that emotions were important. We didn't want to give up emotions because what kids think and feel matters, and we wanted to emphasize the learning aspect of things. And we thought about the importance of connecting social, emotional, and cognitive development, that they're intertwined. So we came up with the term social and emotional learning. We kind of made it up and wrote a book about it. And then the goals of CASEL have always been to advance science, to expand effective practice, and to improve federal and state policies. And CASEL, we think of ourselves as a strategist, a collaborator, a convener, a supporter of the SEL community. I think of myself as a matchmaker very often. I don't have all the answers to a lot of things, but I like to think I have a lot of friends and a lot of colleagues around the country, so I spend actually a good deal of time when someone asks me a question saying, oh, you should go talk to this person or these people about it. So CASEL's been around for 22 years now. And the field, I think, has grown tremendously. The first book that we wrote, Promoting Social and Emotional Learning Guidelines for Educators, was published by ASCD in 1997. And 9 of us co-wrote the book. And let me tell you, a different time, 20 years ago, it's not like we were sending emails back and forth with attachments and stuff like that. We had conference calls twice a week, and talking about the book and how we were going to pull it together and how we were going to define this field. And so 9 of us wrote that book, but now more recently, the Handbook of Social and Emotional Learning that came out last year has 95 contributors, many in this room. And so the field has grown, I think, quite a bit over time. Social and emotional learning, we've had our definition for years, which, and this thing could be redefined, I think, in the next 2 years with the commission, though, or updated. And one of the joys you have when you feel you've introduced the field, if you're going to redefine the field, it's like we feel we have the right to do that, at a certain point. But we've focused on the fact that SEL involves processes through which children and adults develop fundamental social and emotional competencies. And the ones that we've emphasized are understanding and managing emotions, setting and achieving positive goals, feeling and showing empathy for others, and establishing and maintaining positive relationships and making responsible decisions. These are kind of the 5 areas that we have emphasized in different ways. But we also talk always not just about the competencies that kids need to develop, but the environments they need to grow in. So it takes place in the context of safe, participatory school, family, and community environments that support the kids' development, and again, provides opportunities for them to grow and develop over time. So another part of CASEL that we were faced with in the beginning, and with the field of social and emotional learning, and Denise Gottfredson and others have done work to demonstrate it. There's a lot of prevention going on in school, and there's a lot of youth development going on in school. It's just all fragmented, and there's no common language, and it's all piecemeal, the implementation. So we've tried to think of some more systemic work where, if you think about this with a base on school, family, community partnerships, and how do you integrate the character, the service learning, the citizenship education, the health promotion, the academic instruction and integration? How does it all fit together in a strength-based approach that is coordinated and systemic, is part of what we have tried to deal with. So we talk about SEL as a process of acquiring knowledge, skills, and attitudes related to 5 core competency areas. And part of this is self-awareness and self-management, knowing yourself and being able to manage yourself. Part of it is social awareness and relationship skills, understanding and empathy for others, how to deal with others effectively and deal with conflict. And then how do you make responsible decisions about yourself and your social relationships? So when we came up with the CASEL 5, this was really an attempt to foster integration in the field. It's kind of a conceptual model. If you know yourself, if you can manage yourself, if you know others, you manage relationships with others, if you make good decisions about yourself and others, you're going to be in pretty good shape. And we have focused and say, okay, so that should start probably prenatally and go through adult life. But there's the focus on the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, and something around the cognitive, especially, and moral decision-making that enters into this process as well. And so the framework has been one, and a lot of what we have done is to foster this integration, so when people focus too much on the persistence, grit, executive function side of things, we're saying, well, let's balance it with the compassion, empathy, social side of things. And even that as kind of just a framework to balance programming, I think has been enormously helpful for people to think about. There are a lot of different models. This actually was one before I got involved with CASEL, I used to, I designed elementary, middle, and high school programs and worked with teachers on their implementation and did a lot of research in this area. And this is like a social information processing model. We always have exercises. If we had more time, we could have, well, what do you want kids who graduate from high school to be and to know? What do you want them to know? I always want them to be caring, connected, responsible, contributing problem solvers. So it's not surprising that I came up with a model like this, a social information processing model, a metacognitive model. This is from a middle school program that I designed years ago, the Social Competence Promotion Program for Young Adolescents, that where we taught this. Took 27 lessons to teach this model. I could never do it in fewer. There are a lot of ways to enhance social competence through explicit instruction, through integration with academic and curriculum areas, through teacher instructional practices, through climate and culture. So there's not like one approach. There's multiple approaches. And a lot of the programs that look at this work look at skill acquisition, about attitudes that kids have about self, others, learning in schools, and how does the environment change. And then a lot of the programs, again, look at, well, what's the impact on positive social behavior, reducing conduct problems and emotional distress, or improving academic performance. A lot of the work, thank you, Pat, that we do, we're interested in the 5 competencies, but a lot of our work now is really systemically focused. So when we work with the school, we're asking what goes on with curriculum and instruction, day-to-day in the classroom, what are school-wide practices and policies that can influence kids' development, how do you connect with families and communities. So a lot of our models now are going well beyond programs to systemic work, both at the school and the district level. I thought I'd spend a little bit of time. So this meta-analysis, it's kind of interesting just to say that when CASEL does work, and it's the fun part of the work that we do, we have now it's a board, it used to be a leadership team, who would say, hey, Roger, in the past, we think that there have been enough studies to do a meta-analysis for social and emotional learning. So, and then they say, okay, so find the best person in the world to work with and do it, you know. And so Joe Durlak, I think, is, you know, if he's not the best in the world, he's done like 10 meta-analyses now, and people like him, you know, if he had been busy, he might have called Mark Lipsy, I don't know. But, you know, it's like you call people and you say, hey, you want to do this? So Joe and I, and actually Joe and I met a long time ago when he had done another meta-analysis, and I was a discussant at APE. This was on mental health that he did, and I was the discussant. And I just spent time talking about how I hated meta-analysis. And he took it with such good nature. If you know Joe, he's very funny and very smart. And so we did this project together, and Allison Dimnicki and Rebecca Taylor and Kristen Schellinger, they were graduate students we worked with at the time. They're all done now. But where we, from UIC and Loyola. But so we did this meta-analysis, and it took us years to do. And Joe, we describe kind of as somewhere between the meta-analytic maniac and the meta-analytic guru. We collected 700 studies to look at originally. We looked at universal programs, programs for kids with problems, in school, out of school, family, community. We collected everything. And then but one of the studies focused on school-based work, and that's the child development study. And the child development study, we kind of looked at, okay, so our programs explicitly focused on kids' social and emotional development. It can be by focusing on the learning environment, it can be focused on skill development, but we want to take a look at the impact. And what we found across skills, attitudes, pro-social behavior, conduct problems, and emotional distress were improvements in those areas. When we got the impact, and it was only on 37 studies, but it was linking social and emotional learning programming to academic achievement performance. Then there was an 11 percentile gain. That was, like, to us, very surprising. Okay, because we said, okay, so you do this SEL stuff, obviously it's going to affect skills and some pro-social behavior, and it reduces conduct problems. We didn't really know for sure about what the link would be with academic performance. And the fact that this finding came out, I think, is transforming the field in some way. Because one of the things that has happened, and you know, it's an effect size maybe of, I don't know, 0.27 or something like that. But the effect sizes could be bigger if people became more intentional about doing this work and integrating SEL with academics. So I think in a lot of ways, this study created this linkage. In fact, we used to be the Collaborative to Advance Social and Emotional Learning. We changed our name in about 2001 based on what superintendents said to the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning. We actually argued about that for a year and a half and did a book before we changed our name. because we wanted to make sure there was an empirical base for the work, and we wanted to make sure some of the people in Castle in the beginning, it was a social justice agenda. It was a mental health agenda more than an academic school agenda, and so we had to balance some of those things. We've evolved as an organization over time. But this finding, I think, is very important, and within the field of SEL, the meta-analysis is more cited than any study that's ever been done in this field. So I think it's been significant. One of the interesting things we looked at was impact on when teachers did these programs versus outside researchers. And we found, not surprisingly actually, we predicted it, that when teachers implemented the programs, there would be more consistent positive results. And that's something that, I think is really important for a variety of reasons. It's not surprising, though, if you have a systemic view of child development, to think that somebody who is teaching the competencies and is with children in an ongoing way rather than people coming in from the outside would have more impact. We looked at quality of implementation and student outcomes, and again, not surprisingly, we found that when things were implemented well, when there was no implementation problem, there were more consistent positive results. When there were problems, you could have a well-designed program, but if it's not implemented well, if there's not good professional learning and support, maybe there's not a positive impact on results. So again, this was the book that I mentioned a few seconds ago. Joe Zins was the editor, where it's actually it's a great book in many ways, and published in 2004, where we invited a variety of leaders in the field whose program had an impact on not just social and emotional development, but academic performance, to write chapters and describe what their theories of action were and why they thought things were working in this direction. And so this linkage is very important. But in a few minutes, I'm going to say be careful about linkages like this. There's longitudinal work that has been done. David Hawkins and his group with the Seattle Social Development Project have done such important work in this area, and they've looked at a program that was designed for 1st through 5th graders, and now they're following up into their 30s, a lot of the people, and doing cost-benefit analyses. And I just use this as an example to lay the foundation. Here's the most recent meta-analysis that we've done with Rebecca Taylor in the lead. That's going to be published in Child Development. We looked at 82 longitudinal studies involving almost 100,000 kids. This is actually the first time I ever shared anything about this publicly, because it's pretty hot off the presses. But what we said is, okay, we're going to look at least 6 months follow-up, because we wanted to have the kids be out of the context of the class where they had the initial intervention, our programming. And in this study, we followed up 18 years. I think that's the Hawkins study. And we found effect sizes significant all between, again, it's not like mind-boggling, dramatic effect sizes, but significant effect sizes across a variety of areas. And the thing in this project that I think is going to be interesting is we define social competence in the beginning, and there's a lot of discussion about this in the field. Is it skills, or is it attitudes, or is it both? And we're more integrative and lumping in our thinking, so we say, well, it's both, in some ways. But then we separated it, because people tend to separate it, and we looked at skills and we looked at attitudes and looked at the long-term prediction for when kids, what was their level of functioning at post-intervention. And the skills were the longest-term positive predictor, which is kind of interesting. And I think if you said to me more than anything, what does this mean? It means that the field's going to have to think more carefully about these issues, and there will be discussions and debates and better research as a function of our reporting this kind of finding. So another thing that Joe and I worked on is the idea that programs that are safe are effective. If there was sequenced, planned instruction, if kids actively practice skills, if there was a focused time where it was clear in everybody's mind we're focusing on social and emotional development of kids, and we're explicit, we wanted the kids to be better problem solvers or decision makers or goal setters. If you have safe programming, there are more benefits than if you don't have safe programming. And the first place we found that actually was in the out-of-school time, okay, where there are a lot of out-of-school time programs where kids come and they do different activities and it's fun and it's good and you know, but without much structure. And then there are other programs that say, no, we're focused on social and emotional development. And so when we did our analysis of out-of-school time programs, I think there were 68 of them, overall there's the main effect. Out-of-school time is better than control groups. But then we looked at SAFE and other programs, and the programs that didn't have these SAFE features were not producing positive outcomes. This has been influential in the out-of-school world, and now we're working, the Wallace Foundation has just funded 9 districts, and we're going to work on this with a major initiative looking at SEL during the school day and SEL in out-of-school time, and what's the connection. Is there value added from combining these efforts? And that's just getting underway now, a 5-year initiative, which I think, again, is very important because a lot of the SEL work to date had, Joe and I, when we did our first meta-analysis, one of our predictions was that if you had out-of-school time and during school time together, out-of-school time alone, during school time alone versus the control group, there'd be value added in the multi-component program. It's just that nobody's really done research in that area, so we couldn't really comment in a careful way about the differential effects of this work. People like Tish know a lot more about this, I think all of you, actually, at the Castle too, know a lot more about this than I would. This actually comes from a study I did a long time ago, where SEL's got to be a twofer. And we could spend a lot of time talking about twofers for social development and academic performance, but it's also got to be good for the kids and it's got to be good for the teachers. And this was just something, and it's representative of an idea that kids who we worked with, many teachers we worked with, said they became better problem solvers in their own life, their communication with students improved, and they dealt with stress in their own lives better. And so this whole question of why people do the work they do, some of it is for the benefit of the kids, some of it is the benefit of themselves, and if these programs are going to be systemic and sustained and people are going to be motivated to do it, I think the dual focus is important. So championing a lot of the work that you guys are doing here, I think, is critical. We've done a national survey of teachers who say SEL benefits students in a variety of ways. Teachers believe that students from all backgrounds can benefit, that it prepares students to be better in the workplace, better citizens, helps them move through school better, and so I think teachers increasingly feel this is something we can do, this is something we should do, but if we're going to do it, we need support. We need support from our principal, we need support from our Board of Education, from our superintendent, we need support from the state and federal government, we need support from each other to learn to do this work well. Another thing that's been interesting in terms of this moving into a greater receptivity nationally is American Enterprise Institute and Brookings got together and did a project on poverty and opportunity and basically made the point that conservatives and progressives could agree that it's not just how many years of schooling you have, but it's what you learn in school, the academic and social and emotional skills that can help to close the achievement gap. So that message is coming across. There now have been cost-benefit studies, and Clive Belfield and Hank Levin and others have done reviews of 6 SEL programs that had longitudinal data and cost information and saw an average benefit cost ratio of $11 gained for every $1 invested. So there's more and more of a case right now for this being economically sensible to do. We're doing a lot more now. I think that for the last 15 years, SEL started as, well, social competence is important for its own right, okay? And then it became a handmaiden, I think, to academic performance. Now, I think if you said, what's the trajectory in the field, it's really focused more on workplace readiness. And, we've been involved a little bit with the Perkins Career and Technical Assistance Act and things like that, making sure relationship skills are a part of a federal law of importance, but also citizenship and the connections there
are important as well. So we think of SEL as a means to a variety of positive outcomes, not just academic performance, although if you're going to do this work in school, obviously that is critical. And there are challenges right now. What should the purpose of school be anyhow? The latest Kaplan poll, Phi Delta Kaplan poll, only 45% said school should be for academics. Another 51% said either citizenship or workplace. So, you know, we've done our work, but they're also international. I finally met this guy, Rene Dijkstra, who is in Amsterdam. And Rene, and Sklad is the guy, the first author of their meta-analysis. But Rene, who's more dramatic than I am, said failure or refusal to adopt and appropriately support the implementation of SEL Skills for Life programs is equal to depriving children and youngsters of crucial and scientifically substantiated opportunities for their personal, social, and academic development. This would be a flagrant violation of the United Nations Convention of Rights. Now, that's a little stronger than I might have put some of this, but it's just interesting. He's a respected academic, I think, who's done reviews, and so this, I think, it's important to point out as the field grows that there are diverse people involved. I'm going to go through quickly with a couple of other quick comments and then open it up for conversation. We feel overall that there's a lot of evidence now that says that SEL works. We think it's doable. And we think it needs support in implementation. When we start with any new community, it's always focused on a basic question. We don't bring things for them to do. We start with a basic question, self-reflection. What do we want our children to become, to know, and be able to do when they graduate? And then how can an entire community be organized to ensure that students reach these goals? There's no cookie-cutter approach to do SEL, and that sometimes frustrates people, but it's just real. We come in, I think we're influenced by Martin Luther King and also people like Karen Pittman, who say we don't want kids who are just problem-free. We want them fully prepared and we want them fully engaged, and part of being fully engaged is contributing, and you know, to your school, to your family, to your community, to your friends, and that's a core part of this work. We started, again, Castle. We never created our own program. We set standards for the field, and we review preschool, elementary, middle, and high school programs as part of the work, like consumer report guides, okay? And where we look and we say, what's the research base? What's the design promoting competencies? What's the support for implementation that's provided? So one of the things that we've tried to do is set standards for programs. And that work is ongoing. We may extend it to adult. Tish and I talked about that last night. You know, looking at programs that are more focused on adults rather than just the kids, and looking at impact there. And we may look at out-of-school time over time as SEL, you know, as people recognize that SEL is not pre-K to 12 only, and as people recognize it's not school only, we're trying to expand our work. Mary Etney O'Brien, who was a very close collaborator of mine for many years, she passed away in 2010, but Mary and I worked together for 15 years. We finished our first program review, and this is the Castle, or maybe my mentality, or you know, it's like we finished, we said, oh, we did it all wrong. It's not just about programs, it's about school-wide programming. So now we do work on systemic school-wide programming and how to work with the school team on establishing a vision and assessing what's going on, the resources and needs, and how do you embed professional learning in the work, and how do you implement and coordinate and integrate evidence-based practices, and how do you use data for continuous improvement. So the models that we work with now are much more kind of, I think, systemically oriented and school-wide. We're working with a lot of districts, 10 districts, 8 districts originally, but we've been adding new districts over time. Now we're working with about 20. And there won't be time now. We have a very complicated theory of action. And it's just to say that some of it has to do here with the district-wide. What are the things we're doing at the district level? What are we doing at the school level? What kinds of outcomes do we expect to find? This work that we're doing is being evaluated externally by the American Institutes for Research over the past bunch of years. And if I were to say in a simple way, the findings that are kind of complicated is we started with 8 districts initially with this project, the collaborating districts at work, because we expected that 4 of them would fold. Okay, we thought budget problems, we thought turnover of superintendents, 4 of them aren't going to make it. Well, all 8 of them are still doing the work, and all of them, some have had turnover of 3 superintendents, and it just speaks to the importance of systemic work. But over time, in each of these districts, and beyond our expectations, they are more committed to doing this work. They continually assess what's going on with their resources and how to improve things. They are implementing evidence-based programs, and they're implementing continuous improvement systems. There's more work to be done in that area. There are some positive results over time. Again, this is kind of complicated. We're not in the world of randomized controlled trials here. We don't assign districts to condition here. But there has been positive change, at least in the districts while they're doing this and while they're being committed to it in academic achievement and social competence and climate perceptions and attendance and discipline. There's some positive results. If you say, is it mind-boggling? No, but it's important, and it's moving in the right direction, I think, a lot of this work. In 2001, I was asked to be on work with a group in Illinois, the Children's Mental Health Partnership. I'm the token academic on all state and federal and local committees for kids. And they passed the Children's Mental Health Act and said, let's develop standards, social and emotional learning standards, which the state of Illinois did in 2005. And now we're working with 17 states. In fact, I go back to a meeting on December 8th and 9th in Chicago, where we are going to have 10 states come in, and we talk about what policies do you have in place, what do you want to implement, do you want to do standards, very controversial now. A lot of people don't like the word standards anymore because they think that it assumes assessment, it assumes accountability, so some of the language is changing over time. But they're very motivated to create structures, and we're talking about how to connect the district work and state work together. And part of this involves specifying what kids should know and be able to do, pre-K to 12, linking it to curriculum and instruction, linking it to professional development, and linking it mostly to formative assessment. I mentioned we have our assessment work group that's underway. There are 4 goals with that group I just thought I would mention quickly. We're working on, in the same way we have a safe and sound guide for programs, we want to have a safe and sound kind of guide for assessment measures. And that's not just do they have good reliability and validity, but it's do they have clear statements about how to use the data, and do they return data quickly, if people use certain kinds of measures. So we're working on that. With Stephanie Jones' goal 2, Camille Farrington is in the group, and a couple of others, again, who have worked kind of on different models, and we're looking at the way, there are about probably 20 different frameworks in this field. We're trying to look more deeply and see where the commonalities and where the distinctions are. We expect to find a lot more commonality than some people might suspect. We're also starting an annual design challenge for next generation performance tasks. This is with Clark McCowan at Rush University and a guy named Noah Bookman who's with the core districts in California. But we're going to have educators and researchers turn in tasks in an annual challenge and look at some of the key design principles for creating practical measures. And then the other thing, and this is a very Castle-esque of us, but we're very frustrated because there's 20 people in the group, but there's probably hundreds, literally hundreds. We already have 125 people who have signed up for a broader network that we'll be working with on social and emotional competence assessment. And we just started a newsletter and where we want to foster exchanges among a lot of people in the field. I'll just say one thing because it comes up. What's the role of SEL, social competence assessment, and accountability? We've been concerned about that. In fact, very often you say, oh, what gets assessed gets addressed. Here's an opportunity for the field to thrive. For the most part, we've been worried that this is an opportunity for there to be amazing blowback in a lot of ways. And I could tell stories about why probably. But we like what CORE is doing with Transformed Ed a little bit in California. They're looking at social competence assessment, but they're doing it in a very careful way and with very low stakes connected to it. And we'll learn from that experience. But where our focus has been more on thinking of, well, how do you use formative assessment? There are a lot of different ways to measure this stuff. And then one of the questions that's come up, well, what do you think of school climate for accountability? And we're supportive of that, in part because all of us got involved with CASEL because we think what kids think and feel matters. And we want to take them seriously and give them some voice. So while we don't want them to say, well, I know my feelings or I know how to get along with others, we do want them to be able to comment on the safety of schools, on when they have problems, can they go to people who help them within the schools, and are the people responsive and things like that. So there's a lot of social, there will be issues with that and how to use school climate measurement, but it's an interesting and important direction to go in, I think. So it comes back again. This is where I started. I won't repeat the work again, but maybe you have a little bit more context with this overview about why we think a national commission is important, why we think assessment's important, why we think documenting classroom, school-wide, district-wide best practices are important. I could talk a lot more about the state work that we're doing, which, again, the main thing I'll say there is we were funded to work with 5 states by Robert Wood Johnson, and that's what we plan to do. And then we had a bidders conference. We had no idea how many people would come on the conference, and 26 states came on the conference, and 18 submitted proposals, and they only get $5,000 from us. It's not like we're making them rich by doing this, but we also create a community of practice, and we provide some consultation and support. And then we said, we basically said we feel terrible. We don't want to say no to any of these states. They all have good ideas. And then an article was written about this in Ed Week, and for the first time in my career, a funder called me and said, how many states aren't you funding? I said, 10. They said, well, we want to fund you. Why don't you send us a proposal? And I sent them a proposal on a Thursday. On Friday, they called and said, okay, we're going to fund you to do this work. So I think there's a lot of interest with ESSA and what you do at the state level. And I'll just finish. I looked for like a Jefferson quote and stuff like that. I said everybody probably has one. So I have a Franklin Delano Roosevelt quote that I think is really important. He says, we can't always build the future for our youth, but we can build the youth for our future. I think more than ever now, with what's going on in our country and globally, the change that's taking place, this is a time more than ever where we really have to focus on what are the competencies that kids need, what are the competencies that adults need, and how are we all going to work together to make this world a better place for all of us to live in. And I passionately believe, it's probably why I have this commitment, that social and emotional learning is a core part of the answer. If we don't learn how to get along better, if we don't know how to talk with each other and communicate better and listen better and problem solve creatively together, the world's going to be in trouble. And so this has to be, I think, a high priority for all of us to advance this work. Thank you. I think we have time, like 25 minutes or 23 minutes for questions. Yeah. Our comments. Tish.
So I was thinking about the effect sizes in those meta-analyses, and then I was looking at that continuous improvement graph, and it kind of looks like there's this slow increase, right, in a way, over time. So do you ever see, I mean, those are means across a lot of different data points. Do you see, when you look at the, kind of when you dig into the weeds, do you see places where you see like tipping points happening, where a certain concentration of intensity is making bigger gains in some way? Do we know anything about the uptake and the quantity of the uptake in these schools, and how that relates to the outcomes at all?
Yes, a little bit. Let me say something first at the district level, and then go to the school level. At the district level, you can take a district like Cleveland. Cleveland basically said, because of our context, we want every kid to have the same programming, and we're going to do it all within 2 years, the implementation. So we are implementing paths, and we're going to start with pre-K to 2. Everyone in the district gets it. Then we're going to go 3 to 5. Everybody in the district is going to get it. And that was their model of implementation. And I think they had a rationale for it in some ways. Austin said, we're going to take 5 years to do this work. And we have 11 vertical teams. We're going to, from K to 12. We're going to start with 2, and they're the early adopters. And then we'll go to 5, then we'll go to 8, and then we'll go on. So one thing about this work that I think is important is you could spend a lot of time talking about different implementation models. Do you start elementary, then go middle, then go high school? Do you start with a few early districts? Do you do everyone at once? I mean, these are things when we started the district work. Castle says, whenever we see something and we say nobody knows anything about this, and nobody's going to find out anything about it, those are the types of projects that we take on. So the district work we took on because we were just kind of curious, how are they going to do it? And so our guide actually that we're coming out with tells the stories of how the districts have done things. And there's a push and a pull here that I think is important, because on the one hand, if you said to me, where is there more stability and predictability, I would say a phase and model over 5 years. But then you say, but wait, you can't wait for 5 years for some of these things. So I think that is some of the structure that you have to deal with. At the school level, one of the things that we've started to see is a relationship. If people systematically, and we kind of have our theory of action, the importance of a school team with stakeholders, the importance of doing a resource and needs assessment, the importance of doing implementing programs that are evidence-based, the importance of integrating with other areas of instruction and student support, and doing things like that. And the schools that do more of that seem to have better outcomes. Okay, but that has not been documented experimentally. It's more in the context of a continuous improvement model.
Do you see greater gains in those when you look at it?
Yeah, over time. But the thing on this, which is kind of interesting, is another question is how much of this should be top-down versus bottom-up versus meeting in the middle. And if I were to say one thing at the district level and at the school level that we have really tried to do is work with distributed leadership on this, especially at the district level where superintendents seem to come and go within 3 years, or less in some instances. You have to have an infrastructure of support throughout the system. One thing, by the way, and we never knew this, but it's been interesting, is a lot of the superintendents who have left one district have come to new districts and said, we're doing SEL as our priority. So Maria Karstafen was in Austin, now she's in Atlanta. SEL is a priority. Ed Graff was in Anchorage, Alaska. Now he just moved to Minneapolis. He said, well, could Castle come in? And we start our work with districts by doing an audit. talking with everybody in the district about what has been done, what could be done, what should the priorities be, what should the barriers be. So what's interesting is even with transition of leadership to new places, that's been one of the ways that word is getting out. And if you said to me, who would superintendents rather listen to? Smart people, geeky people from universities and research institutes or other superintendents to make decisions. It's not even close. But I won't say which one it is. Yeah, Sarah.
Quick question. You were talking about the longitudinal meta-analysis and that the skills versus attitudes at the end of the time they were in the program, that the skills was a better predictor of long-term outcomes. And I'm curious about when you reflect on that finding and you think about the measurement work that you're working on, what measures do you see, what skills do you see we really need more refinement and improvement in our measures? What skills do you think are the highest priorities that we'd be able to measure?
Well, of course, with every question, there's a simple answer. The only, H.L. Mencken, I think, it's just that the simple answer is always wrong. So let me start to get a little more complicated. I think probably there are different considerations at elementary, middle, and high school. So there are developmental issues involved. I also have not looked carefully enough at the actual measures, but I suspect that part of the problem and the prediction of some of these things, again, is I wouldn't compare skills versus attitudes because the quality of measures, it's going back to when I said I didn't like meta-analysis, part of the reason is there's a bunch of apples and oranges that exist that you're comparing in the context of that. If you ask me, so I'm not going to give you like a data-based answer from the meta-analysis. I'll just give you a personal answer. I think that kids' problem-solving skills, their decision-making skills, their goal-setting skills, things like that, I think are their relationship skills. I think are really important. And their self-management, so things like stress management and impulse control are probably important too. So I would identify a couple of contenders. One of the things that's interesting about the problem-solving model that I showed before, and this is kind of a challenge. If I went back and read the Weissberg and Allen chapter, which I haven't done, but I know what I was thinking at that time. I remember that. And one of the things that I was thinking is I never found mediation. I looked a lot. I used to do in my trials mediation analysis and how skill acquisition influenced outcomes. And I never really found that much. And somebody, at a certain point, I said, at least in the short term, if I had to predict the quality of how teachers interacted with the students versus the competencies of the students, I thought it was the environmental thing that would lead to at least short-term outcomes. But then the teacher's not with the kids for the whole period of time. So then you say, okay, so now we have to bring in, well, what skills are they internalizing? What skills are they grasping? And but I like to see a lot of them together. I don't want to like pull all of them apart. I kind of, well, how does someone process a situation? And do they have a positive mindset? I can solve, there's a lot of mindsets now, but one of the things, a lot of SEL actually came from the work of Julian Roeder, who Maurice Elias studied with, not as his advisor, but he was at the University of Connecticut where they talked about locus of control and the whole question of having a positive mindset. I can solve problems. I can get along with people. If I can't handle a situation well, I can seek help. Some of this has to do with flexibility of thinking as well.
So that's why I think some of these measurement issues are so complicated. I think that there's a developmental component to it. I think there's a cultural component to it. And I think there's a whole question about, well, is it discrete skills or is it some combination of skills? And do you want to look at things in terms of a processing model, or what is your model even for assessing the skills? So if there were more time, I'd love to know your answer to the question.
I'm interested in, you mentioned maybe one time the sort of disparities in terms of helping, racial, cultural disparities and academic disparities. When I see something like a universal school-wide or district-wide intervention, I worry about sort of this overall positive effect, but something that doesn't necessarily tend to really important contextual, racial and cultural kind of elements. So I'm wondering if there's some research or what you know in terms of how to build those things into the interventions.
Yeah. Well, clearly, what you're raising is one of the most important research tasks to take on. And I think you're asking a question a little bit about moderation and a little bit about mediation probably as well. And in many of the, let me start by criticizing a lot of the studies that we reviewed, say in our meta-analyses. One of the most interesting tables, and I don't remember it off the top of my head, but except for that it's table 1 that you could look at in the Durlach and Hall meta-analysis. The number of studies that don't specify the race of students, the socioeconomic status of students, sometimes even the grade level of students, but it's like 50% of the studies don't even look at that. And then there's a question of the studies that do that, how many actually test for these effects? And if they're testing for the effects, do they do that in a sound way, comparing with random assignments, say, an experimental group and a control group for doing that work? Now, there are some that do that, and there are, but, and if somebody asked me, I have a student who said she'd like to look systematically at this issue as part of a prelim that she's going to be working on, so maybe we'll have answers in a better way. But I think that some people say, well, with these programs, the rich get richer, and so it's the kids who already have the skills who are, benefiting from it. I don't think that that's the case. I think that there is actually more research with kids from urban areas, from poverty areas, and within those groups, some of the kids who have different struggles at the beginning of the intervention, whether those are behavioral struggles, not doing well academically, who show some of the benefits. At least there are a growing number of studies that show that kind of positive impact. We weren't able in our study to detect, though, in the meta-analysis, strong differences between groups. And I think that our finding, but it's not a satisfying finding, is that all the groups seem to show comparable kinds of improvements. But that's not paying attention with a seriousness of purpose to recognizing the diverse world we live in and the diverse backgrounds that people bring to the table, and the diverse array of programming supports that everybody needs. I will say CASEL right now, and over time, the importance of CASEL as a field, social and emotional learning as a field, is we have to take on any new issue that comes on and say, oh, it's important, we have to say something about it, or we have to do something about it. And if you said to me a couple of years ago, what did that mean in MedCom and core and a little bit teacher evaluation, and at least weighing in a little. Then it became multi-tiers, systems of support, then it became disciplinary disparities, and now equity really, and I don't know, maybe it's going to be SEL and choice in a couple of years, or charter schools. We have to figure out everything to some extent. But we now have equity and SEL groups in our districts. Actually, district offices had separate offices, and in the beginning, these two groups really didn't even connect. So Castle, with all of our collaborating districts, is bringing together the people from the equity offices and people from the district offices. Also, we have a new group, a work group that we've put together on SEL and equity. We have some people who care very deeply about English language learners and what's the kind of specific programming that can be helpful there. So I would say that these are understudied areas, and if you talk about going forward in the field and having to do a better job, I think that, and where many of the graduate students here should be focusing their efforts, because you're the present and future of the field, this is a very important area. Yeah.
I had a question about the meta-analysis. Did you include any international research? And
Yeah.
if not, then since you have probably collaborators around the world, what have you learned about how social emotional learning programs and this more systemic way have worked outside the U.S. or if there are any out there?
Yeah. Well, the first answer is there's a lot out there. The second thing is in our longitudinal meta-analysis, and I don't remember the exact number, but I think almost 40% of the studies, something like that, were international. Okay? Now, many of them English speaking and English published, because that's what we could read. But the SCLOD study has mainly, non-US studies. And there are people like Neil Humphrey at the University of Manchester, who has really emphasized the importance and has done some reviews of international work. Within the United States, there are people like Larry Aber, who has worked internationally, or David Osher at AIR, Larry's at NYU. In our handbook, the final chapter in the handbook's a 37-chapter handbook in social and emotional learning. But there's a chapter by Torrente that talks about international work. If you said to me, where do I think the most of it is going on? I think Australia is doing a tremendous amount, and I think that Canada obviously is interested, Great Britain, Sweden, Finland, and some of the European countries. I'm going to Singapore on December 24th to meet with some people. I've worked with the Ministry of Education there for a couple of years, and I think a lot of the Asian countries now have become interested. Larry Aber's work is mostly in war-torn countries with a lot of poverty, so he's doing a lot in Africa and Asia as well. It gets defined differently in different ways, but Neil Humphrey wrote a book on social and emotional learning, which is a good book in 2013, I think, which was a critique, but he talked about the fact that this is like now, it started, I think, largely in the United States, but it's becoming an international phenomenon. Yeah, and there's a lot going on. Yeah.
So you're talking about like going to these districts and there's a lot of interest, and you talk about doing these audits. What do you think sort of systemically is preventing districts and states and schools from being able to implement SEL programming well, or from being able to really prioritize it? Like, do you think there are any kind of systematic barriers or policy barriers that are resisting?
Yeah, like millions of them. Well, let's start with colleges of education. And we have a review coming out. Kim Schoner-Reichel from the University of British Columbia has done this. There's actually a lot of policies that say colleges of education should teach students about child development. And, Bob, he ran a whole panel on this with NCATE a while back, where I think his findings may have been similar to what Kim is going to report in some of her findings. There's some policy that is supportive of this work, even in legislatures, but colleges of education, very few colleges of education do a good job teaching about child development, let alone how to promote
social and emotional competencies. So one of the issues is that sometimes people have left colleges of education not necessarily prepared to do this work when they go into their new school settings. So that's one issue. I think that one of the effects clearly of No Child Left Behind over the past, since 2002, or as the implementation started, was a narrowing of the curriculum, incredible high stress about what the impact is if you didn't raise math and teaching scores. So this was not seen as something necessarily that was a priority. In fact, there's a student who's doing her dissertation with me who and it's a more complicated dissertation, but one of the things she dealt with was if a school's failing to make adequate yearly progress versus doing okay, which school has more SEL? And it's the schools that are doing okay. So, this is almost like a case where if you say one of the things that is important in a school that's failing to make adequate yearly progress, I think the message, if you care about academic performance, you have to care about a lot more than academic performance. You have to care about the kids and their lives and what's important to them and providing social supports, and that doesn't happen as much as it should. And then I still think that we're in a phase right now where we're moving from what has been a compliance culture with incredible anxiety and accountability around test score performance to something new. But the something new with ESSA is giving states and localities more decision making, and they're not quite sure, they haven't been trained how to think about this in these terms either. That's why I think we felt motivated in some of the states to say, well, we want to support this, but what do we do? And so I think that there are not federal structures, state structures that are yet in place that can really help support implementation at the district and school level. And how states and districts interact, one of the things we're dealing with right now, and we're going to explore it much more, this is with some of the new funding, is do districts want states to be involved helping them? It's like the big joke, I'm from the State Department of Education and I'm here to help you. And and so we're dealing a little bit with, well, what's the state-district relationship in supporting some of this work that can be done. Another thing, and this is on a different level that we have to deal with, is there's innovation fatigue. That's probably, when we work with our districts, one of the main things that they talk about is, what is it this week? Or what's the new fad that's coming in? And we can outlast it anyhow. And that's why a little bit, if I talk about simplistic findings from our collaborating districts of work, just the fact that we're there 5 years later, they're there 5 years later, that there are offices of social and emotional learning is kind of amazing because there has been a bit more traction. And part of the question, Castle, I think with 22 years has had more traction than people ever expected. I think when districts take on an innovation and they stick with it, and it's, it needs to be stuck with for 5, 10, 20 years. And so how do you ensure that happens with all the demands that are coming their way? And some of the models are much more integrative models, I think, now than the add-on models. And I think that the field historically has been a little bit too add-on, more at the expense of integration, and I think more research has to be done in that area too.
I'm sorry to say this, but we've run over our time a little bit already. I know there's some additional questions. We've packed your schedule though, so you need to keep going.
I do it, I'm told.
So I apologize to those who haven't had a chance to ask questions for the clock, but hopefully there'll be other opportunities to have exchanges with you. Maybe we'll even invite you back.
Hey, I'll come. rpw@uic.edu. If you want to send me an email with a question, I'll send you a response.
Thank you.